Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into the shadowed halls of Middle-earth to uncover one of its most haunting and mysterious secrets. Deep within the cursed fortress of Minas Morgul, beyond the reach of sunlight and hope, lie vaults that have never been opened by mortal hands. Treasures stolen across millennia by the 9 Nazgûl, hidden in chambers where even Sauron's gaze could not penetrate. This is a story of beauty preserved in darkness, of ancient kings who became wraiths, yet somehow retained fragments of their former selves in the most unexpected way. So before we begin this journey into the Tower of Sorcery together, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's dark adventure. And don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep explorations into Tolkien's hidden corners. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I love seeing our global community of Middle-earth explorers come together for these stories. Now get comfortable, maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite spot, and let yourself be drawn into the shadows of a tale that begins in victory, but leads us to the most unexpected discovery about the nature of evil itself. Listen closely, for this is the chronicle of what happened when the White City finally sent investigators to catalog the abandoned fortress of Minas Morgul, and what they found in the deepest vaults changed everything we thought we knew about the 9 kings, who once ruled in splendor before their fall into shadow. Picture this moment, if you will. The great iron doors of the lowest vault grinding open for the first time in centuries, releasing air that had been trapped since before the fall of Númenórean. The torchlight flickering across walls lined not with instruments of torture or weapons of war, but with something far more disturbing and beautiful. Glass cases perfectly preserved, containing artifacts of such exquisite craftsmanship that they seemed to glow with their own inner light. But here stands the mystery that will haunt you through our entire journey tonight. Each case bears a nameplate, written in the flowing script of ancient kings, and as the investigators realize what they're seeing, one whispers in horror. They weren't just servants of the Dark Lord, they were collecting, they were saving. And in that moment, staring at treasures from kingdoms that had fallen 1,000 years before Sauron ever forged his ring, they understood that the greatest secret of the Nazgûl was not their corruption, but what they had secretly preserved, even as they served the very force that sought to destroy all. Beauty in Middle-earth. What drove 9 fallen kings to risk Sauron's wrath by hiding away the cultural treasures of their lost realms? What were they planning in those lightless vaults that even the Dark Lord never suspected? And why, in their final moments of humanity slipping away, did they choose to become guardians of the very beauty their master sought to obliterate? The answers lie ahead in our journey tonight, through halls where moonlight has never fallen, past chambers where the echoes of ancient songs still whisper in languages that have been forgotten for ages beyond count. We'll walk in the footsteps of investigators who thought they were cataloging the remnants of evil, only to discover something far more complex and heartbreaking about the nature of corruption, memory, and the desperate desire to preserve what cannot be saved. The investigation starts at dawn, in the ruins of what was once the most beautiful city in all of Middle-earth, before it became the most feared. And what the scholars found there will follow us into dreams, and haunt us with its impossible beauty, preserved in the heart of ultimate darkness. The morning mist still clung to the broken walls of Minas Morgul when Master Eldacar of the White Tower's archives arrived with his small expedition. The fortress had stood empty for 2 years now, its pale stones no longer glowing with that sickly phosphorescence that had marked it as the Dead City. King Elisir had ordered a full cataloging of what remained within, both to understand the extent of the Nazgûl's activities and to ensure no dangerous artifacts were left to corrupt the healing lands of Ithilien. Eldacar was a scholar by nature, a man who had spent his life among dusty tomes and ancient manuscripts in the houses of healing and the Tower of Ithilien. His hair had gone silver during the long years of war, but his eyes remained sharp and curious. He had volunteered for this grim task not out of courage, but out of an insatiable hunger for knowledge that had driven him since childhood. The mysteries of the past called to him like songs only he could hear, and the chance to explore the innermost chambers of Sauron's western fortress was an opportunity no scholar could resist. His companion was Boromir the Younger, named for the fallen hero but bearing no relation to him. This Boromir was a captain of the Athelian Rangers, a practical man who understood the dangers that might still lurk in the abandoned stronghold. Where Eldacar saw ancient secrets waiting to be uncovered, Boromir saw potential threats that needed to be neutralized. He had accepted this assignment reluctantly, more concerned with protecting the scholar than with whatever treasures or horrors they might discover within. The two men stood before the main gates of Minas Morgul as the sun crested the Ethel Dwarf. Behind them, casting long shadows across the bridge that spanned the Morgul Duin. The river still ran dark and cold, though it no longer carried the poisonous taint that had marked it during the years of shadow. Fish had begun to return to waters, and green shoots of grass were sprouting along its banks where nothing had grown for generations. The gates themselves were massive affairs of black iron and pale stone, carved with images that seemed to writhe and shift in the early morning light. They stood open now, as they had since the day the mouth of Sauron had ridden forth for the last time. But there was something unsettling about walking through them voluntarily. Every step echoed strangely in the courtyard beyond, as if the very stones remembered the marching feet of orc legions and the silent gliding of the Nazgûl on their fell beasts' dot as they moved deeper into the fortress. Eldacar found himself marveling at the architecture despite its dark history. Minas Morgul had been built originally as Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, fairest of all the cities of Gondor's youth. Even corrupted and twisted by centuries of evil inhabitation, traces of its original beauty remained. The proportions of the hallways were pleasing to the eye, the curves of the staircases flowed like frozen music, and here and there a carving or doorway retained enough of its original form to hint at the splendor that had once been, but it was the silence that struck them most forcefully. Not the peaceful quiet of a library or garden, but an oppressive stillness that seemed to muffle their footsteps and absorb their whispered conversations. It was the silence of a tomb, of a place where life had been systematically drained away until only emptiness remained. The very air felt thin and stale, as if it had not moved freely for decades. They had brought with them maps drawn by the Rangers who had first secured the fortress after the War of the Ring. Rough sketches that showed the basic layout of the upper levels and marked the locations where obvious dangers had been found and neutralized. But the maps were incomplete, showing only what could be observed during a hasty military sweep. The deeper chambers, the private quarters of the Nazgûl themselves, remained unexplored territory. Their first destination was what the maps identified as a great hall on the second level. A vast chamber that had likely served as a throne room or meeting place during the fortress's years of darkness. The Rangers had reported seeing what appeared to be empty weapon racks and armor stands, suggesting it might have been used to equip the orc armies that had marched from Minas Morgul during the war. As they climbed the winding staircase that led to the upper levels, Eldacar found his mind wandering to the history he knew of this place. Minas Ithil had fallen to the Nazgûl in the year 2002 of the Third Age, over 1,000 years ago. For all those long centuries, 9 ancient kings turned. Wraiths had dwelt within these walls, serving the Dark Lord, but maintaining their own hierarchy and purposes. What had they done with all that time? How had they filled the endless nights when they were not riding forth on their master's errands? The Great Hall, when they finally reached it, proved to be a disappointment from a scholarly perspective. It was indeed vast, with a high vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above their torchlight, but it had been stripped bare. Whatever furnishings or decorations it had once contained were long gone, leaving only empty stone and the lingering sense of ancient malevolence. The weapon racks the Rangers had noted were present, but they held nothing more interesting than rusted orc blades and a few pieces of corroded mail. But as they were preparing to leave the hall and continue their exploration, Boromir noticed something that the earlier military survey had missed. Hidden behind a fallen tapestry in the far corner was a small doorway, barely shoulder height and easily overlooked in the shadows. The door itself was made of some dark wood that had not rotted despite the centuries, and it bore a lock of unusual design wrought in the shape of a coiled serpent with eyes of polished jet. The serpent lock yielded to Boromir's skilled touch after several tense minutes of careful manipulation. As the mechanism clicked open with a sound like breaking glass, both men felt a strange sensation, as if the very air around them had suddenly become lighter. The door swung inward on hinges that moved without a whisper of sound, revealing a narrow corridor that descended into darkness beyond the reach of their torchhoig.el. Felt his heart quicken with the thrill of discovery. This was what he had come for, the hidden passages and secret chambers that no map could chart. He stepped forward eagerly, but Boromir's firm hand on his shoulder brought him to a halt. "Wait," the ranger whispered. "Let me go first. We don't know what might be waiting down there." The corridor was narrow enough that they had to walk single file, with smooth stone walls that curved gently downward in a spiral pattern. As they descended, Eldacar noticed that the air was growing warmer rather than cooler, and there was a faint scent that he couldn't quite identify. It was pleasant, almost like sandalwood or cedar, completely at odds with the mustiness and decay they had encountered in the upper levels of the fortress. The corridor ended at another door, this one made of the same dark wood but bearing no lock at all. Boromir pushed it open cautiously, and they found themselves standing at the threshold of something neither had expected to find in the heart of Minas Morgul. It was a library, but unlike any library either man had ever seen. The chamber was circular, with shelves carved directly into the stone walls that rose to a domed ceiling high above. But what made it extraordinary was not its size or architecture, but its contents and condition. Every shelf was filled with books, scrolls, and manuscripts that appeared to be perfectly preserved. The air here was dry and clean, as if some enchantment had kept the ravages of time at bay for centuries. Eldacar moved forward in wonder, his scholarly instincts overriding any sense of caution. The books were arranged with obvious care, organized by some system that spoke of a trained librarian's attention to detail. Many bore titles in languages he recognized, Western and Sindarin primarily, but there were others in scripts that predated the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. Some volumes were bound in leather, that still retained its supple texture and rich color, while others were wrapped in silk that felt smooth beneath his trembling fingers. As he examined the collection more closely, patterns began to emerge that filled him with growing amazement. Here was a section devoted entirely to the history and genealogies of the royal houses of Númenórean, including texts he had thought lost forever when Elendil's library was destroyed in the last alliance. There was another section containing what appeared to be the complete surviving works of the lore masters of a region, including treatises on ringcraft that he had only heard whispered about in the most secretive corners of Rivendell. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the care with which everything had been maintained. These books had not simply been looted and dumped here like treasure in a dragon's hoard. They had been cataloged, organized, and preserved with the devotion of someone who truly understood their value. Small placards written in flowing Tenwar script marked different sections, and he found evidence of careful conservation work, pages that had been reinforced with silk threads, bindings that had been lovingly repaired. While Eldacar lost himself in scholarly rapture, Boromir remained more alert to their surroundings and potential dangers. The ranger had little interest in ancient books, but he had developed an instinct for recognizing when something was not as it appeared. This library troubled him deeply, though he could not quite put his finger on why. Everything about it suggested care, learning, and preservation, values completely at odds with everything they knew about the Nazgûl, and their master. In the center of the chamber stood a reading table carved from a single piece of white stone, probably marble, with a surface that had been polished to mirror smoothness. Upon it lay an open book, as if someone had been reading and had simply stepped away for a moment, intending to return shortly. The pages were covered with notes written in multiple hands in different inks, marginalia that suggested ongoing scholarly discussion and debate. Eldacar approached the table with the reverence he might have shown at a shrine. The open book proved to be a copy of the Akalabth, the account of the fall of Númenórean, but this version contained passages he had never seen before. The margins were filled with corrections and additions in various hands and loose papers. Tucked between the pages contained what appeared to be first-hand accounts from survivors of the destruction. As he read, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the chamber. These were not the notes of some disinterested scholar collecting curiosities. These were the annotations of people who had lived through the events described, who had personal knowledge of the kings and queens mentioned in the text, who could correct errors and add details, because they remembered these things from their own experience. The implication struck him like a physical blow. The Nazgûl had been kings and sorcerers of Númenórean and the eastern lands before Sauron corrupted them with the 9 rings. Of course they would remember the fall of the island kingdom, would know details that had been lost to later historians. But why preserve this knowledge? Why maintain this library with such obvious care and devotion? Boromir's voice interrupted his thoughts, calling softly from across the chamber. The ranger had discovered another door, smaller and more carefully concealed than the one through which they had entered. This door bore no serpent lock, but instead was secured with a mechanism that looked almost like a puzzle box, requiring not a key but knowledge to open. As they stood before this new barrier, both men realized that what they had found so far was merely the beginning. If the Nazgûl had maintained one secret library, what else might lie hidden in the depths of their fortress? And why did everything they discovered seem to contradict the simple narrative of 9 kings who had fallen completely into evil and shadow? The puzzle lock proved to be more complex than either man had anticipated. Its surface was covered with rotating rings inscribed with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the flickering torchlight. Eldacar studied the mechanism intently, his scholarly mind working to decipher the pattern. The symbols appeared to be a mixture of Tengwa script and older, runes that predated even the founding of Gondor. After nearly an hour of careful manipulation, during which Boromir grew increasingly restless and alert for any signs of danger, the lock finally yielded with a soft chiming sound like distant bells. The door swung open to reveal not another corridor, but a chamber that took their breath away with its unexpected beauty. They were looking into what could only be described as a treasure vault, but not the kind of treasure vault they had expected to find in an evil fortress. Instead of gold coins and jeweled weapons, the chamber contained artifacts of incredible artistry and historical significance. Display cases made of crystal clear as mountain water lined the walls, each one containing objects that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Eldacar moved forward like a man in a trance, his eyes wide with wonder at what lay before him. In the nearest case rested a crown of mithril and sapphires that he recognized from ancient illustrations as belonging to the kings of Rudor, lost when that kingdom fell to the Witch King over 1,000 years ago. Beside it lay a set of ceremonial armor crafted in the Númenórean style, its surface etched with flowing designs that seemed to move and dance in the torchlig. Each display case bore a small placard, written in the same flowing script they had seen in the library, identifying not only the artifact within, but its provenance and historical significance. These were not random spoils of war, carelessly gathered and hoarded. Every piece had been carefully selected, catalogued, and preserved according to strict scholarly principles. As they moved deeper into the chamber, the scope of the collection became increasingly staggering. Here were treasures from kingdoms and cultures spanning thousands of years of Middle-earth's history. A harp that had belonged to Gil-galad himself, its strings still taut and gleaming despite the ages. A banner of Gondolin, somehow preserved through the fall of that hidden city and the chaos of the First Age. Scrolls containing the original charters of alliance between Elendil and Gil-galad, documents that historians had believed lost forever. What struck Eldacar most forcefully was not the value or rarity of individual pieces, but the obvious care with which they had been maintained. Every artifact showed signs of regular attention and conservation. Metal pieces had been cleaned and treated to prevent corrosion. Fabrics had been carefully stored in environments that would preserve their fibers. Books and scrolls had been protected from moisture and decay with what appeared to be sophisticated preservation techniques. Someone had loved these things, had understood their true value beyond mere material worth, and had dedicated enormous time and effort to ensuring their survival through the long ages of darkness. Boromir found himself increasingly troubled as they explored the vault. His military training had taught him to think in terms of weapons and strategic resources, but nothing here fit those categories. These were cultural artifacts, items of historical and artistic significance rather than practical value. What possible use could the Nazgûl have had for elven poetry, or Númenórean genealogies, or the crown jewels of fallen kingdoms? In the center of the chamber stood a pedestal supporting what appeared to be the most significant piece in the entire collection. It was a palantir, one of the seeing stones of Númenor, but this one was different from the others they had heard described. Instead of the dark, brooding presence that characterized the stones that had fallen under Sauron's influence, this one seemed to radiate a gentle, warm light that was somehow comforting rather than threatening. Eldacar approached the seeing stone with extreme caution, knowing the dangers such artifacts could pose. But as he drew closer, he became aware that something was different about this palantir. Images seemed to flicker across its surface, not the commanding visions imposed by a hostile will, but gentle glimpses of scenes from Middle-earth's past. He saw the towers of Númenor in their glory, the halls of Khazad-dûm when they rang with the songs of the dwarves, the gardens of Gondolin in eternal spring. These were not strategic intelligence or tools of surveillance. They were memories, preserved like pressed flowers between the pages of a beloved book. Someone had been using this palantir not to spy or command, but to remember, to keep alive the beauty of things that had been lost to time and war and the grinding passage of ages. As this realization struck him, Eldacar felt a profound shift in his understanding of what they were discovering. This was not the horde of conquerors or the arsenal of servants of darkness. This was something far more complex and heartbreaking, a desperate attempt to preserve the cultural heritage of Middle-earth, by beings who had themselves been instrumental in its destruction. But who among the Nazgûl could have possessed such knowledge and dedication? And more troubling still, how had they managed to pursue this preservation work without Sauron's knowledge or interference? The Dark Lord was known for his complete intolerance of any activity that did not serve his purposes directly. The very existence of this chamber suggested a level of deception and rebellion that seemed impossible for beings so completely under his dominion. As they prepared to examine more of the vault's contents, Boromir noticed something that made his blood run cold. At the far end of the chamber, partially hidden behind a large display case, was yet another door. But this one was different from the others they had encountered. It was larger, more ornate, and carved with symbols that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy that set his teeth on edge. Whatever lay beyond that door, he realized was likely to be far more dangerous than anything they had yet encountered. The preservation and scholarship they had found so far might be only a facade, concealing something far darker and more sinister in the depths below. The ornate door at the far end of the vault seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like a slow heartbeat carved in stone and metal. Unlike the other barriers they had encountered, This one bore no lock or puzzle mechanism. Instead, it stood slightly ajar, as if inviting them to enter while simultaneously warning them away. The symbols carved into its surface were unlike anything Eldacar had seen in his years of study, flowing script that seemed to writhe and change when observed directly. Boromir's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt as they approached, every instinct screaming danger. But Eldacar was already pushing the door open, his curiosity overriding his caution. The chamber beyond was smaller than the vault they had just left, more intimate in scale, but somehow more oppressive in atmosphere. Here, finally, was what they had expected to find in the fortress of the Nazgûl. The walls were lined with weapons, and armor of obvious evil intent, blades that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it, helms crafted in the shapes of skulls and demons. But even these implements of war showed the same careful maintenance they had observed elsewhere. The weapons were oiled and sharp, the armor polished and free of rust. Someone had been tending to them with the same devotion shown to the cultural artifacts in the outer chamber. At the center of the room stood 9 pedestals arranged in a perfect circle, each bearing a different object. These were clearly personal items, things that had belonged to each of the 9 individually rather than being part of their collective hoard. Eldacar moved carefully among them, studying each display with growing fascination and horror. The first pedestal held a crown of black iron set with stones that seemed to absorb light, but beneath the obvious corruption lay craftsmanship of incredible skill. The metalwork was flawless, the proportions perfect, and small details suggested it had once been a thing of beauty before whatever dark enchantments had transformed it into its current state. On the second pedestal rested a mirror of polished obsidian, its surface so perfect it seemed like a window into some other realm. But this was no ordinary scrying glass. Ancient texts Eldacar had read spoke of mirrors that could show not what was, but what had been, allowing their users to look back through time itself. If this was indeed such an artifact, it represented power beyond anything the kings of Númenor had possessed. Each pedestal revealed new mysteries. A golden amulet that radiated warmth despite its sinister appearance. Books written in languages that predated the awakening of elves. Rings of power that were clearly lesser siblings to the great rings of power, but impressive works of craft in their own right. But what struck Eldacar most forcefully was the obvious personal connection each item had to its owner. These were not just magical tools or symbols of authority. They were personal treasures, items that had been cherished and maintained not for their power, but for their emotional significance. The mirror showed signs of frequent use, as if someone had spent countless hours gazing into its depths, searching for glimpses of times long past. The books were filled with marginal notes and annotations, evidence of careful study and deep thought. As he examined the artifacts more closely, Eldacar began to piece together a picture that challenged everything he thought he knew about the 9. These had been scholars and lore masters before their fall, men who had valued knowledge and beauty as much as power and dominion. The corruption that had transformed them into wraiths had not completely destroyed those aspects of their personalities, but had twisted them into something far more complex than simple evil. Boromir discovered the next revelation, his practical soldier's eye noticing what the scholar had missed. Hidden behind the circle of pedestals was a narrow staircase leading downward, so well concealed that it was nearly invisible until viewed from exactly the right angle. The steps were worn smooth by countless passages, suggesting frequent use. Over many centuries, as they descended this final staircase, both men felt the weight of ages pressing down upon them. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made their skin crawl and their hair stand on end. Whatever lay at the bottom of these stairs was the true heart of the mystery they had been unraveling, the source of all the contradictions and impossibilities they had encountered. The staircase ended in a chamber that defied easy description. It was simultaneously ancient and timeless, carved from living rock, but shaped by forces beyond mere mortal craft. 9 alcoves lined the walls, each one containing what appeared to be a throne carved from a single massive gemstone. But these were not seats of power or authority. They were something far more personal and heartbreaking. Each throne was surrounded by personal effects that spoke of lives lived before corruption, before the rings that had doomed their owners to an existence between life and death. Here was a child's toy, carefully preserved and maintained, despite the centuries that had passed. There a woman's portrait, painted with such skill and love that even the shadows seemed unable to diminish its beauty. Musical instruments, books of poetry, letters written in hands that trembled with emotion. This was a shrine, Eldacar realized with growing horror and pity. The 9 had created a place where they could remember who they had been before. Sauron's gifts had stripped away their humanity. In these alcoves, surrounded by the remnants of their former lives, they had maintained some connection to the people. They had once been, even as their bodies faded into shadow and their wills bent to serve the Dark Lord. But if this chamber was a shrine to their lost humanity, it also revealed the scope of their secret rebellion against everything Sauron represented. They had not simply preserved random artifacts and treasures. They had systematically saved everything they could of Middle-earth's cultural heritage, creating a hidden archive that could outlast the darkness their masters sought to impose upon the world. The question that remained, burning in both men's minds as they stood among these impossible revelations, was simple but profound. If the 9 had retained enough of their humanity to create this vast preservation project, what had they ultimately intended to do with it? The discovery of the shrine chamber left both men shaken in ways they had not anticipated. Eldacar found himself struggling with emotions he could barely name, a mixture of profound sadness and disturbing admiration for beings he had been taught to consider absolute evil. Boromir, more practically minded, was troubled by the strategic implications of what they had found. If the Nazgûl had maintained such independence of thought and action, what other assumptions about the enemy might prove false? They spent hours in the Chamber of Thrones, examining each alcove with the care due to sacred ground. Every personal artifact told a story of loss that transcended simple corruption. Here was evidence of the 9's lives as mortal men, kings and sorcerers who had loved and been loved, who had created beauty and cherished it, who had faced the same joys and sorrows as any mortal being dot in one alcove, clearly belonging to a king who had ruled some eastern realm lost to history. They found children's drawings carefully preserved between sheets of crystal. The crude figures and bright colors spoke of innocent joy, of a father who had treasured these simple gifts more than all the gold in his treasury. Another contained what appeared to be love letters, written in a feminine hand and filled with such warmth and devotion that reading them felt like an intrusion into the most private moments of lives. Long ended, but perhaps most striking was the care with which these personal shrines had been maintained. Despite the centuries that had passed, despite the corruption that had claimed their owners' bodies and souls, someone had continued to tend these memories. Dust had been regularly cleared away, fabrics had been preserved from decay, and metal objects had been kept free of tarnish and corrosion. As they explored deeper into the complex of chambers that lay beneath the fortress, they began to understand the true scope of what the 9 had accomplished in secret. Beyond the shrine lay workshops where skilled artisans had labored to preserve and restore the artifacts in their collection. Here were tools for bookbinding and manuscript preservation, equipment for cleaning and treating ancient metals, and supplies for the delicate work of maintaining fabrics and artwork. Across centuries, the workshop showed signs of recent use, as if the artisans had only recently abandoned their labors. Half-finished restoration projects lay on workbenches, and supplies were arranged with the kind of order that spoke of ongoing activity rather than historical abandonment. But who had been doing this work? Surely not the Nazgûl themselves, who had long since lost physical form. Yet the skill required for such delicate preservation work suggested training and knowledge that could not have been easily replaced. In a chamber adjacent to the workshops, they found living quarters that provided part of the answer to this mystery. These were not the grand halls or throne rooms they might have expected in the Fortress of Dark Kings, but simple, modest rooms equipped with the basic necessities of life. Beds, tables, chairs, all crafted with skill but without ostentation. The belongings scattered about suggested scholars and craftsmen rather than warriors or sorcerers. Eldakar examined the personal effects with growing amazement. Books on preservation, techniques, manuals for the care of ancient artifacts, treatises on the history and culture of Middle-earth's various peoples. These were the quarters of people who had dedicated their lives to learning and preservation, who had chosen to serve the cause of cultural conservation even in the heart of enemy territory. But who were these people? How had they come to be here, living and working in the deepest chambers of Minas Morgul, without the knowledge of Gondor's forces? And most troubling of all, where had they gone? The living quarters showed signs of hasty abandonment, as if their occupants had fled recently and in great haste. As they continued their exploration, they discovered a chamber that provided answers to some of these questions while raising even more disturbing possibilities. It was a map room with detailed charts covering the walls showing not military positions or strategic targets, but the locations of libraries, archives, and repositories of cultural treasures throughout Middle-earth. Many locations were marked with symbols indicating successful preservation efforts, while others bore notations suggesting ongoing projects or future targets. The scope of the operation revealed by these maps was staggering. The Nine had not confined their preservation efforts to their own fortress, but had been conducting systematic rescue operations throughout Middle-earth for centuries. Libraries threatened by war, archives endangered by neglect, private collections at risk of dispersal or destruction, all had been identified and, where possible, either preserved in place or carefully relocated to safety. But the most disturbing discovery came when Boromir noticed a cluster of recent markings on the map covering Gondor and Rohan. Fresh ink marked locations throughout both kingdoms, with particular attention paid to the archives of Minas Tirith and the ancient halls of the Doras. Whatever the Nine had been planning, it had involved extensive operations in the very heartlands of their enemies. A thick journal resting on the central table in the map room provided further insights into the scope and purpose of these activities. Written in multiple hands and spanning what appeared to be several decades, it detailed preservation projects undertaken throughout Middle-earth. The entries were clinical and scholarly, focused entirely on the cultural and historical value of the items being preserved, with no mention of military or strategic considerations. But as Eldakar read deeper into the journal, he began to notice patterns that chilled him to the bone. The preservation efforts had accelerated dramatically in recent years, particularly after Sauron's return to physical form and the beginning of his final war against the Free Peoples. It was as if the Nine had known that time was running short, that their master's ultimate victory would mean the destruction of everything they had spent centuries protecting. The final entries in the journal were the most disturbing of all. They spoke of contingency plans, of methods for ensuring the survival of Middle-earth's cultural heritage, even if the forces of darkness achieved complete victory. References to hidden caches scattered throughout the wilderness, to loyal servants who would continue the work even if their masters were destroyed, to secrets that had been shared with unlikely allies who might carry on the mission in darker times ahead. As the full implications of what they had discovered began to sink in, both men realized they were confronting something far more complex than a simple military investigation of an abandoned fortress. The weight of their discoveries pressed heavily upon both men as they ventured deeper into the labyrinthine depths beneath Minas Morgul. The map room had revealed the scope of the Nine's secret operations, but it had also raised questions that seemed to challenge the very foundations of everything they thought they knew about the nature of good and evil, loyalty and betrayal, corruption and redemption. as they moved through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly into the heart of the mountain. Eldacar found his mind returning again and again to the journal entries they had read. The clinical precision of the writing, the obvious care with which each preservation project had been planned and executed, the deep knowledge of cultural and historical significance that informed every decision, all pointed to minds that had retained their capacity for scholarly thought and aesthetic appreciation even after centuries of service to the Dark Lord. Perhaps most disturbing was the growing realization that the Nine's preservation efforts had not been random or haphazard. There was a pattern to their choices, a deliberate attempt to create a comprehensive archive of Middle-earth's cultural heritage that could survive even the complete triumph of darkness. They had been preparing for their master's victory, but in a way that would ensure something of beauty and meaning would endure beyond the age of shadow they helped to bring about. The corridor they were following began to slope upward, and the air grew fresher as they climbed. Eventually, they emerged into a chamber unlike any they had yet encountered, a vast natural cavern that had been carefully shaped and cultivated over centuries. The ceiling soared high above them, supported by columns that had been carved to resemble the mallorn trees of LOTR, complete with leaves that seemed to shimmer in the soft light that emanated from some unseen source. This was clearly meant to be a place of peace and contemplation, a refuge from the harsh realities of the fortress above. Gardens had been laid out with meticulous care, featuring plants and flowers from every corner of Middle-earth. Here bloomed Elainer from the Golden Wood, alongside Athilas from the healing houses of Gondor and the hardy mountain flowers of the Misty Mountains. Water flowed in carefully designed channels, creating the gentle sound of brooks and streams that spoke of distant meadows and peaceful valleys. But what struck both men most forcefully was the obvious recent care the gardens had received. Plants had been watered and tended, dead growth had been cleared away, and new seedlings showed evidence of recent planting. Someone had been maintaining this underground paradise even after the fall of Sauron and the supposed destruction of the Nine. As they wandered through the garden paths, Eldacar began to notice stone markers placed at regular intervals throughout the plantings. Each one bore inscriptions in various languages, identifying not only the plants themselves, but their origins and the circumstances under which they had been acquired. Many spoke of rescue operations, of rare specimens saved from destruction during wars or natural disasters, of careful cultivation, designed to preserve varieties that existed nowhere else in Middle-earth. The pattern was becoming clearer with each discovery. The Nine had not simply been collectors or hoarders. They had been engaged in a systematic effort to preserve not just the cultural artifacts of Middle-earth's peoples, but the very essence of what made each land and culture unique. They had been creating a living museum, a place where future generations could experience the full richness and diversity of their world, even if the originals were lost to war and time. In the center of the garden stood a structure that took their breath away with its unexpected beauty. It was a pavilion built in the ancient elven style, with graceful arches and flowing lines that seemed to grow naturally from the living rock beneath. But this was no mere copy of elven architecture. It incorporated elements from all the great building traditions of Middle-earth, blending Númenórean stonework with dwarven craftsmanship and the organic curves favored by the woodland peoples. Inside the pavilion, they found what could only be described as a hall of memory. The walls were lined with alcoves, each one containing not artifacts or treasures, but carefully preserved samples of soil, stone, and water from significant locations. Throughout Middle-earth, here was earth from the Shire, still carrying the faint scent of pipeweed and growing things. There was stone from the peak of the Lonely Mountain, and sand from the shores of the Grey Havens, where the ships sailed west into the uttermost sea. Each sample was accompanied by detailed notes describing not just its physical properties, but its cultural and emotional significance. The soil from Rohan carried, with it descriptions of the wide grasslands and the songs of the horse lords who rode beneath endless skies. The water from the Miramir held within it the memory of Khazad-dûm's glory and the grief of its fall. These were not scientific specimens, but emotional touchstones, ways of preserving not just the physical reality of places, but their spiritual essence. As LOTR studied these memorials to Middle-earth's landscapes, he began to understand something profound about the nature of the Nine's transformation. Their corruption had not destroyed their capacity to appreciate beauty or their understanding of what gave life meaning. Instead, it had twisted these qualities into something more desperate and poignant, a frantic attempt to hold on to the very things their service to Sauron was helping to destroy. Boromir, meanwhile, had discovered something that brought their theoretical understanding crashing back into practical reality. Hidden behind one of the larger alcoves was a communication device of some kind, a palantir much smaller than the one they had seen in the treasure vault, but clearly designed for more immediate and practical use. And judging from the warm glow emanating from its depths, it had been used recently. The implications hit both men simultaneously. The preservation network the Nine had established was still active, still operating even after the destruction of their physical forms and the fall of their master. Somewhere in Middle-earth, the work was continuing, guided by loyalists who had survived the war and remained committed to the mission of cultural preservation. But who were these people, and what did they intend to do with the vast archive of knowledge and artifacts they had assembled? The active palantir cast an eerie glow across the pavilion as both men stared at it in stunned silence. The stone pulsed with a gentle rhythm, clearly responding to some distant communication, and occasionally, images flickered across its surface too quickly for them to interpret clearly. But what they could make out was deeply unsettling. Glimpses of figures moving through libraries and archives, carefully packing manuscripts and artifacts with the same meticulous care they had observed throughout the hidden chambers of Minas Morgul. LOTR reached toward the seeing stone with trembling fingers, but Boromir caught his wrist before he could make contact. The ranger's face was grim with concern, knowing full well the danger such artifacts could pose to untrained minds. They had both heard tales of those who had gazed into Palanturi and found their sanity shattered by what they witnessed, or, worse, found themselves enslaved by hostile wills operating the stones from distant locations. But as they debated whether to risk direct contact with the device, it suddenly flared with brilliant light, and a voice emerged from its depths, speaking in the flowing cadences of ancient Númenórean, but with an accent neither man recognized. The words were formal and ritualistic, clearly part of some established protocol for communication within the preservation network. "The archives of Forlinden have been secured," the voice reported. "The manuscripts of the shipwrights have been moved to the secondary location as planned. The collection includes the original designs for the white ships of the Teleri, preserved since the Elder Days. Estimated completion of the transfer, 3 days hence." Another voice responded, this one clearly coming from the palantir itself, rather than some distant location. The accent was different, more familiar to their ears, though still strange, and the tone carried an authority that suggested this was a coordination center for the entire operation. Acknowledged. "What news from the Southern Archive? The Rangers of Athelion have begun patrolling closer to our operations than previously observed. Recommend shifting the Osgiliath collection to the mountain cache until their movements return to normal patterns. The risk of discovery is becoming significant." As the conversation continued, both men began to understand that they were listening to the coordination of a massive ongoing operation. The preservation network was not only still active, it was expanding its efforts, moving quickly to secure cultural treasures from locations throughout Middle-earth, before they could be lost to neglect or deliberate destruction in the chaos that often followed great wars. But what chilled them to the bone was the obvious knowledge these voices displayed about current political and military situations. They spoke of ranger patrols with the familiarity of people who had been observing such activities for extended periods. They discussed the movements of various groups and officials with an intimacy that suggested extensive intelligence networks still operating throughout the kingdoms of the Free Peoples. The conversation revealed locations of hidden caches scattered throughout Middle-earth, from the misty mountains to the shores of the Bay of Belphalus. It spoke of loyalists embedded within the libraries and archives of major cities, people who had spent years or even decades in positions of trust while secretly serving the preservation mission. Most disturbing of all, it revealed that the operation had been preparing for exactly the situation that had now arisen. The fall of Sauron and the chaos that would follow in the wake of such a momentous change. As they listened, a picture began to emerge of an organization that had been planning for multiple possible futures. If Sauron had achieved victory, the preserved materials would have been hidden away to survive the Age of Darkness that would follow. But if the Dark Lord fell, as had now occurred, the plan was apparently to accelerate preservation efforts while the various kingdoms were still recovering from war and before new systems of control and oversight could be established. The voices spoke of opportunities that would exist only in the immediate aftermath of the war, of archives that could be accessed while their guardians were distracted by reconstruction efforts, of collections that could be relocated while attention was focused elsewhere. It was clear that the Preservation Network viewed the current period as a critical window of opportunity that might not come again for generations, but perhaps most unsettling was the tone of the conversation, which carried no hint of malice or conquest but spoke with the passionate dedication of scholars and preservationists who genuinely believed they were saving irreplaceable cultural treasures from destruction. These were not the voices of servants of darkness pursuing some evil agenda, but of people who saw themselves as the guardians of Middle-earth's heritage, protecting it from those who might not understand its true value. As the communication session drew to a close, the voices began discussing future operations that made both men's blood run cold. Plans were being laid to infiltrate the archives of Minas Tirith itself, to make contact with sympathetic scholars within the White City who might be willing to assist in preservation efforts. There was talk of approaching the libraries of Rivendell, and even the archives of the Grey Havens, locations that held some of the oldest and most precious manuscripts in all of Middle-earth. The final exchange before the Palantir went dark revealed perhaps the most disturbing information of all. The voices spoke of a great gathering that was being planned, a meeting of all the major figures in the preservation network to coordinate their efforts for what they called the final phase of their mission. This gathering was to take place in a location they referred to only as the Sanctuary of Remembrance, somewhere that could accommodate large numbers of people and vast quantities of preserved materials. As silence fell over the pavilion, both men realized that what they had discovered went far beyond a simple archaeological investigation of an abandoned fortress. They were looking at evidence of a vast conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of the new age of peace that King Elisir was trying to establish. The Preservation Network, whatever its noble intentions, represented a shadow government operating outside the authority of any legitimate kingdom, with resources and capabilities that could pose a significant threat to political stability throughout Middle-earth. But even as they grappled with the political implications of their discovery, neither man could entirely dismiss the beauty and nobility of what the Nine had created in their hidden sanctuary. The silence that followed the Palantir's dimming felt heavy with implications that neither man was fully prepared to confront. They stood in the heart of what should have been an enemy stronghold, surrounded by evidence of a cultural preservation effort so vast and sophisticated that it challenged everything they thought they understood about the nature of good and evil, loyalty and betrayal. Eldacar found himself torn between his scholarly admiration for what had been accomplished and his growing unease about the methods being employed. The voices they had heard spoke with genuine passion about preserving Middle-earth's cultural heritage, But they also demonstrated a willingness to operate outside legal authority and to infiltrate trusted institutions in pursuit of their goals. How many librarians and archivists throughout the kingdoms were secretly serving this shadow organization? How many trusted scholars were feeding information to a network that ultimately traced its origins back to the Nine? As they continued exploring the chamber complex, they discovered evidence that the Preservation Network's activities went even deeper than they had initially realized. A series of smaller chambers branched off from the main pavilion, each one dedicated to a specific aspect of the preservation mission. One contained detailed genealogies and family histories, meticulously maintained records that could trace bloodlines and cultural connections across centuries of Middle-earth's history. Another held maps and surveys that documented changes in the landscape over time, showing how wars and natural disasters had affected different regions and what cultural sites might be at risk. But perhaps most revealing was a chamber they found, dedicated entirely to what could only be described as cultural intelligence gathering. The walls were covered with detailed reports on the current state of libraries, archives, and private collections throughout Middle-earth. These reports were clearly the product of extensive observation and infiltration, containing information that could only have been gathered by people with intimate access to the institutions in question. The reports revealed a troubling picture of neglect and decay affecting many of Middle-earth's most important cultural repositories. Libraries that had survived the war were struggling with damaged buildings and reduced staff. Private collections were being broken up and sold as families dealt with the economic disruption that followed the conflict. Ancient archives were being abandoned as their traditional guardians focused on more immediate concerns of reconstruction and recovery. From one perspective, the Preservation Network's activities could be seen as a necessary response to a genuine crisis. Cultural treasures that had survived for thousands of years were at risk of being lost forever if immediate action was not taken to preserve them. The network had the resources, knowledge, and dedication necessary to save irreplaceable artifacts that might otherwise disappear into private hands or simply crumble away from neglect. But from another perspective, the network's operations represented a massive violation of sovereignty and trust. They were taking materials from their rightful owners without permission, infiltrating trusted institutions, and building a parallel archive system that operated entirely outside the oversight of legitimate governments. Whatever their intentions, they were fundamentally undermining the authority of the kingdoms. They claimed to be protecting. As Eldakar studied the intelligence reports more closely, he began to notice patterns that suggested the network's activities were becoming increasingly bold and extensive. Recent entries described operations that went far beyond simple preservation, including efforts to influence policy decisions in various kingdoms and to recruit new members from positions of authority within established institutions. There were references to sympathetic nobles who had been approached about providing funding and political protection for preservation activities. There were mentions of scholars who had been gradually introduced to the network's philosophy and recruited to serve as sources of information or active participants in operations. Most troubling of all, there were indications that the network was beginning to view itself not just as a preservation organization, but as the rightful guardian of Middle-earth's cultural heritage, with the authority to make decisions about what should be preserved and where it should be kept. The transformation from noble mission to shadow government seemed to be accelerating in the aftermath of Sauron's defeat. With their original masters destroyed and the immediate threat to Middle-earth's cultural heritage intensifying due to post-war chaos, the network appeared to be evolving into something that its founders might not have intended, but that followed logically from their original premises. In a locked chest hidden beneath one of the planning tables, Boromir discovered documents that revealed just how far this evolution had progressed. These were not reports or intelligence summaries, but planning documents for what appeared to be a comprehensive reorganization of how cultural preservation would be managed throughout Middle-earth. The network was preparing to reveal itself, to step out of the shadows and present itself as the legitimate authority for all matters relating to historical and cultural preservation. The documents outlined a vision of centralized control over all major libraries, archives, and museums, with the network serving as the coordinating authority that would determine preservation priorities and resource allocation. They spoke of establishing formal relationships with the various kingdoms, offering their expertise and resources in exchange for official recognition and authority over cultural matters. But perhaps most revealing was the underlying assumption that ran through all these planning documents, the belief that the network possessed superior knowledge and dedication that qualified them to make decisions about cultural preservation on behalf of all the peoples of Middle-earth. There was no consideration given to the possibility that the legitimate owners of these cultural treasures might have their own ideas about how they should be preserved and displayed. No acknowledgement that different cultures might have different values and priorities regarding their own heritage. As both men absorbed the full implications of what they were reading, they began to understand that the noble mission they had initially admired was transforming into something far more problematic. The Preservation Network, born from the Nine's desperate attempt to save beauty in a world they were helping to destroy, was evolving into a new form of tyranny, one that would control the past in order to shape the future according to its own vision of what Middle-earth should become. The question that haunted both men as they prepared to delve deeper into the complex was whether this transformation was an inevitable corruption of the original noble mission, or whether the seeds of this authoritarian vision had been present from the very beginning. The deeper they delved into the network's plans, the more both men realized they were confronting something that defied easy categorization as either good or evil. The Preservation Network had grown beyond its original mission into something that possessed its own momentum and logic, driven by people who genuinely believed they were serving the greater good while simultaneously undermining the very foundations of the society they claimed to protect. As they continued their exploration, they discovered a chamber that served as a kind of council room, with a large circular table surrounded by chairs carved from different woods representing the various regions of Middle-earth. Maps and documents covered the table's surface, but these were different from the operational reports they had seen elsewhere. These appeared to be philosophical treatises and position papers, attempts to articulate the intellectual foundation for what the network was trying to accomplish. Eldikar found himself drawn to these documents, despite his growing unease about their implications. The writing was sophisticated and thoughtful, grappling seriously with questions about the relationship between cultural preservation and political authority, between the rights of individual communities and the broader interests of historical scholarship. The authors clearly understood the controversial nature of what they were proposing and had attempted to develop ethical frameworks that would justify their activities. One document in particular caught his attention, a lengthy essay titled "The Guardianship of Memory," that appeared to be the work of multiple authors writing over an extended period. The text argued that cultural heritage belonged not to any particular kingdom or people, but to all of Middle-earth, and indeed to future generations who had not yet been born. From this premise, the authors concluded that no single political authority could be trusted with decisions about preservation priorities, since local interests would inevitably conflict with broader concerns about historical accuracy and scholarly access. The essay went on to argue that the Preservation Network, because of its independence from political pressures and its dedication to scholarly principles, was uniquely qualified to serve as the guardian of Middle-earth's cultural memory. The network's members had demonstrated their commitment through centuries of dangerous and thankless work, often at great personal risk and without any hope of recognition or reward. They had developed expertise that could not be easily replaced and had built relationships with sources of information throughout Middle-earth that would take generations to duplicate. But what made the document truly unsettling was its gradual shift from these reasonable-sounding premises to conclusions that were far more radical. The authors argued that the network's superior knowledge and commitment gave it not just the right, but the obligation to make decisions about cultural preservation, even when those decisions conflicted with the wishes of local authorities or communities. They spoke of the need to overcome parochial attachments and sentimental nationalism that prevented people from understanding the true significance of their own cultural heritage. The final sections of the essay outlined a vision of Middle-earth, in which cultural preservation would be managed by a class of scholar guardians who would operate above and beyond the authority of kings and governments. These guardians would have the power to relocate cultural artifacts to locations where they could be better preserved and studied, to restrict access to materials that might be misused or misunderstood by untrained individuals, and to make binding decisions about research priorities and scholarly interpretation. As Eldikar read these passages, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground chamber's temperature. The network's vision was not simply about preserving cultural artifacts, but about controlling how the past would be remembered and interpreted. They were proposing to become the arbiters of historical truth, with the power to determine which stories would be told and which would be forgotten, which interpretations would be accepted and which would be suppressed. Boromir, meanwhile, had discovered evidence of how this philosophical vision was being translated into practical action. A series of detailed operational plans outlined strategies for gradually expanding the network's influence within existing institutions, identifying potential recruits among scholars and librarians who might be sympathetic to their goals, and developing the infrastructure necessary to support a vast expansion of their preservation activities. The plans revealed a sophisticated understanding of political and social dynamics, showing how the network intended to exploit the chaos and uncertainty that followed major conflicts to advance their agenda. They would present themselves as a solution to the very problems they had helped to create, offering their expertise and resources to communities struggling with damaged libraries and disrupted educational systems. But perhaps most disturbing was the network's apparent willingness to manufacture crises that would justify their intervention. The plans included strategies for identifying cultural collections that were vulnerable to loss or damage, and then creating circumstances that would make such losses more likely unless the network stepped in to provide protection. They spoke of cultivating relationships with individuals who could influence policy decisions, and of using their access to rare materials as leverage to gain concessions from political authorities. As both men studied these documents, they began to understand that the network had evolved far beyond its original mission of preserving cultural artifacts. It had become a shadow organization with its own agenda, one that viewed the legitimate governments of Middle-earth as obstacles to be overcome rather than authorities to be respected. The network's members genuinely believed they were serving a higher purpose, but their methods and goals had become indistinguishable from those of any other group seeking to accumulate power and influence. The tragedy was that the network's original mission remained genuinely important and necessary. Middle-earth's cultural heritage was indeed at risk, and there was a real need for coordinated preservation efforts that could transcend political boundaries and local interests. But the network's evolution into an authoritarian organization threatened to discredit these legitimate concerns and to create new conflicts that would make effective preservation even more difficult. As they prepared to explore the final chambers of the complex, both men realized they were facing the choice that would have implications far beyond their original mission to catalog the contents of an abandoned fortress. They had discovered evidence of a conspiracy that threatened the stability of the new age of peace, but they had also uncovered a preservation effort of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The weight of their discoveries pressed down upon both men like a physical burden as they made their way toward what appeared to be the final chamber in the complex. Every revelation had added new layers of complexity to what should have been a straightforward investigation, transforming their understanding not only of the nine Nazgûl, but of the very nature of corruption and redemption, duty and rebellion, preservation and control. The passage leading to this ultimate chamber was different from all the others they had encountered. Where the previous corridors had been carved from living rock or built with careful stonework, this one seemed to have been shaped by forces beyond mortal craft. The walls curved organically, like the inside of some vast shell, and the air itself seemed to hum with an energy that made their skin tingle and their thoughts feel strangely clear and focused. As they walked, Eldacar found himself thinking about the philosophical implications of what they had discovered. The Preservation Network represented something unprecedented in the history of Middle-earth, an organization that had transcended the boundaries between good and evil, loyalty and betrayal, creation and destruction. Its members genuinely believed they were serving the cause of truth and beauty, yet their methods increasingly resembled those of tyrants and conquerors. The chamber they finally entered took their breath away with its sheer scope and ambition. It was vast beyond anything they had yet encountered, a hollow space carved from the heart of the mountain that soared upward until its ceiling disappeared in shadows above their torchlight. But what made it truly extraordinary was not its size but its contents. They were standing in what could only be described as the ultimate library, a repository of knowledge that dwarfed anything that had existed in Middle-earth since the great libraries of Númenórean had been swallowed by the sea. Shelves carved directly from the mountain stone rose in terraced levels around the chamber's walls, each one filled with books, scrolls, tablets, and manuscripts representing thousands of years of accumulated wisdom and learning. But this was not simply a larger version of the collections they had already discovered. As they explored the chamber more closely, they realized they were looking at something far more ambitious and troubling. The network had not simply been preserving existing knowledge, they had been rewriting and reinterpreting it according to their own understanding of historical truth. Entire sections of the library were devoted to what appeared to be corrected versions of well-known historical texts, with marginal notes and commentary that challenged accepted interpretations and offered alternative explanations for major events. The writers drew on sources that were unavailable to conventional scholars, including the first-hand memories of beings who had lived through the events in question. But they used this privileged access to support conclusions that would have been considered heretical by mainstream historians. Eldacar found himself examining a revised version of the tale of the Kinstrife that cast the conflict in an entirely different light, portraying King Eldacar not as a rightful ruler defending his throne but as a usurper whose victory had set Gondor on a path toward inevitable decline. The arguments were sophisticated and well supported, drawing on documents and testimonies that he had never seen before, but the implications were staggering. If these interpretations were correct, much of what he had believed about Gondor's history would need to be reconsidered. But as he continued reading, he began to notice subtle patterns in the revisionist interpretations that disturbed him deeply. The revised histories consistently portrayed strong centralized authority as beneficial and local autonomy as dangerous. They emphasized the importance of scholarly expertise over popular opinion and suggested that many of Middle-earth's conflicts could have been avoided if decisions had been left to wise counselors rather than elected leaders or traditional rulers. The more he studied these texts, the more he realized that the network was not simply preserving and correcting historical knowledge, but subtly reshaping it to support their own vision of how society should be organized. They were using their privileged access to rare sources and their reputation for scholarly accuracy to gradually introduce ideas that would justify their own authority and delegitimize existing political structures. Boromir, meanwhile, had discovered something even more disturbing in a section of the library devoted to contemporary affairs. Here were detailed dossiers on political leaders throughout Middle-earth, compiled with the same meticulous attention to detail they had observed in the historical collections. But these were not simply biographical sketches or intelligence reports. They were assessments of each leader's reliability and usefulness from the network's perspective, with recommendations for how they might be influenced or, if necessary, replaced. The dossiers revealed an intimate knowledge of the personal lives, political relationships, and psychological weaknesses of kings, lords, and officials throughout the free kingdoms. They contained information that could be used for blackmail or manipulation, along with strategic analyses of how political situations might be shaped to advance the network's interests. Most troubling of all, they included detailed succession plans that outlined who the network would prefer to see in positions of authority if current leaders were to be removed from power. As both men absorbed the implications of what they were reading, they began to understand that the preservation network had evolved into something far more dangerous than they had initially realized. It was not simply an organization dedicated to cultural preservation that had adopted questionable methods, but a shadow government that was actively working to reshape Middle-earth according to its own vision of enlightened rule. The network's ultimate goal appeared to be the establishment of a new form of governance in which political authority would be subordinate to scholarly expertise, where decisions about law, policy, and social organization would be made by a class of educated guardians who possessed superior knowledge and wisdom. They genuinely believed this would create a more just and stable society, but they were prepared to use deception, manipulation, and if necessary force to achieve their vision. The terrible irony was that this authoritarian vision had emerged from the Nine's original desperate attempt to preserve beauty and meaning in a world threatened by ultimate darkness. The noble impulse to save what was precious had been corrupted by the assumption that those who possessed knowledge were qualified to impose their will upon those who lacked it. Standing in the heart of this vast repository of accumulated wisdom and carefully crafted propaganda, both men realized they had discovered not just a conspiracy, but a tragedy of unprecedented proportions. At the very heart of the vast library, on a raised platform that seemed to be carved from a single piece of midnight black stone, they discovered the final and most devastating truth. 9 pedestals arranged in a perfect circle supported what could only be described as the ultimate archive, the culmination of everything the Nazgûl had worked toward during their centuries of secret preservation efforts. Each pedestal held a crystal sphere that pulsed with inner light, and as Eldakar approached them with trembling steps, he realized he was looking at something that challenged the very foundations of reality as he understood it. These were not simply storage devices or seeing stones, but something far more profound and terrible. They were repositories of pure memory, crystallized experiences that contained not just knowledge about the past, but the actual lived experiences of those who had witnessed history unfold. The first sphere he examined contained what appeared to be the complete memories of the 9 themselves, their experiences from the time they had been mortal kings through their corruption and transformation into wraiths. But these were not the twisted recollections of beings driven mad by centuries of servitude to the Dark Lord. These were clear, unclouded memories that had been somehow preserved from the corruption that had claimed their physical forms and conscious minds. As he gazed into the swirling depths of the crystal, images began to form that showed him the 9 as they had been before their fall. He saw proud kings ruling just kingdoms, wise counselors advising their people with genuine concern for their welfare, scholar kings who had built great libraries and supported learning and the arts. These had been good men, perhaps not perfect, but certainly no more flawed than any other mortal rulers, who had genuinely sought to use their power for the benefit of their subjects. But the memories also revealed the gradual process by which they had been corrupted, and it was far more subtle and insidious than the simple narrative of evil rings and instant domination that most histories suggested. Sauron had not simply enslaved them with magical compulsion, but had gradually convinced them that their noble goals could only be achieved through the acquisition of greater power and knowledge. He had shown them the chaos and suffering that followed from the ignorance and short-sightedness of common people, and had persuaded them that only those with superior wisdom should be entrusted with making important decisions. The rings had not corrupted them so much as they had amplified existing tendencies toward paternalistic authoritarianism that had always been present in their characters. They had genuinely believed they were saving their people from themselves, protecting them from the consequences of their own limitations and mistakes. Even as their bodies faded and their humanity slipped away, they had retained this fundamental conviction that they were serving the greater good. The second sphere revealed something even more shocking. The memories showed that the Nine had never fully submitted to Sauron's will, but had maintained a secret resistance throughout the centuries of their apparent servitude. They had carried out his orders and served his purposes, but they had also systematically undermined his ultimate goal of reducing Middle-earth to a wasteland, devoid of beauty and meaning. Every act of preservation, every artifact saved from destruction, every piece of cultural knowledge protected from the ravages of war and time, had been a small act of rebellion against their master's vision of absolute dominion over a world stripped of everything that made life worth living. They had served the Dark Lord with their actions while defying him with their deepest convictions, creating the vast preservation network as their way of ensuring that something of value would survive even if he achieved complete victory. Remaining spheres contained the memories of the network's other key figures, the scholars and craftsmen and loyalists who had carried on the work after the Nine's destruction. These memories revealed the true scope of what had been accomplished, showing preservation operations that had saved irreplaceable treasures from dozens of conflicts and disasters throughout Middle-earth's history. But they also revealed the gradual transformation of the network from a desperate preservation effort into something far more ambitious and controlling. As Eldacar absorbed memory after memory, he began to understand the terrible logic that had driven this transformation. Each generation of network members had seen more clearly than the last how ignorance and short-sightedness led to the destruction of precious cultural heritage. They had watched helplessly as political conflicts destroyed irreplaceable archives, as economic pressures led to the dispersal of important collections, as changing fashions and priorities caused people to neglect or actively destroy the legacy of their ancestors. Gradually, the network's members had concluded that the only way to truly protect Middle-earth's cultural heritage was to remove it from the control of people who did not understand its true value. What had begun as emergency preservation efforts during times of crisis had evolved into a systematic program of cultural control that would ensure such crises could never again threaten the accumulated wisdom of ages. The final sphere contained something that made both men's blood run cold. Detailed plans for what the network called the Great Revelation, the moment when they would emerge from the shadows and present themselves to the peoples of Middle-earth as the rightful guardians of their cultural legacy. The memories showed vast hidden caches of preserved materials scattered throughout the continent, loyalist cells embedded within every major institution of learning, and carefully laid plans for seizing control of libraries and archives throughout the Free Kingdoms. But perhaps most disturbing was the network's genuine conviction that they would be welcomed as saviors rather than conquerors. The memories revealed a profound disconnect between the network's self-perception and the reality of what they had become. They saw themselves as selfless servants of truth and beauty, protecting precious knowledge from those too ignorant to appreciate its value. They could not understand that their methods had transformed them into the very thing they had originally sought to resist, a force that would impose its will upon others regardless of their wishes or consent. Standing before these repositories of crystallized memory, both men finally understood the complete tragedy of what they had discovered. The preservation network represented the corruption of the noblest possible impulse, the desire to save beauty and meaning from destruction, into something that threatened to destroy the very freedom and autonomy that gave life its meaning. Weight of absolute knowledge pressed down upon both men as they stood surrounded by the crystallized memories of centuries. In the pulsing light of the memory spheres, Eldacar finally understood the complete scope of what they had uncovered. And with that understanding came a profound sense of responsibility that threatened to overwhelm him. They were no longer simply investigators cataloging the remnants of an abandoned fortress, but witnesses to a truth that would reshape how Middle-earth understood its own history and future. The final memory sphere, the largest and most brilliant of all, contained something that neither man had expected to find: a complete record of every preservation operation the network had ever conducted, along with detailed inventories of everything they had saved from destruction. The scope was staggering, beyond comprehension. Over the centuries, they had rescued the contents of hundreds of libraries, thousands of private collections, and countless individual artifacts that represented the pinnacle of various cultures' achievements. But more than just a catalog of preserved materials, the sphere contained something far more valuable and dangerous: the complete cultural memory of Middle-earth itself, preserved in its entirety from the earliest days of Elven awakening to the most recent events of the War of the Ring. This was not history as it had been recorded by fallible chroniclers or remembered by aging witnesses, but the actual lived experience of those who had shaped the world's destiny. As Eldacar gazed deeper into the sphere's depths, he saw the truth behind legends that had been distorted by countless retellings. He witnessed the real conversations between Elrond and Gil-galad before the last alliance, the actual words spoken by Isildur at Mount Doom, the genuine motivations behind decisions that had shaped the fate of nations. This was history stripped of interpretation and bias, the raw material from which all future understanding of the past would need to be constructed. But with this ultimate knowledge came an equally ultimate burden. The memory sphere revealed not just what had happened, but why it had happened, showing the complex web of causes and consequences that had led to each major event in Middle-earth's history. And what it revealed was often deeply troubling, challenging comfortable narratives and beloved myths that had sustained peoples through dark times. The sphere showed that many of the heroes, celebrated in song and story, had been deeply flawed. Individuals whose noble achievements were mixed with acts of questionable morality. It revealed that some of the great victories of good over evil had been won through methods that were themselves morally compromising, and that some apparent defeats had actually served a greater purpose that was invisible to those living through the events. Most disturbing of all, the sphere revealed that the current age of peace and prosperity that King Elisir was trying to establish was built upon foundations that were far more fragile than anyone suspected. The memories showed patterns repeating throughout Middle-earth's history, cycles of growth and decline that suggested the current peace was likely to be temporary, just another brief interlude between periods of conflict and chaos. Boromir, watching his companion's face as he absorbed these revelations, saw the terrible cost of ultimate knowledge written in every line and shadow. The ranger had little interest in historical scholarship, but he understood the practical implications of what they had discovered well enough. The network possessed information that could destabilize governments, discredit institutions, and shatter the carefully constructed narratives that held societies together. But the memory spheres revealed something even more profound about the nature of the network's transformation from noble preservation effort to authoritarian conspiracy. The crystallized memories showed that this change had not been a deliberate choice made by any single generation of network members, but rather the inevitable result of possessing knowledge that others lacked. Each generation had begun with the best of intentions, seeking only to preserve and protect what was precious. But as they gained access to more complete and accurate information about the past, they inevitably began to see the ignorance and mistakes of those around them more clearly. They watched political leaders make decisions based on incomplete information or popular misconceptions, saw scholars perpetuate errors that they could easily correct, witnessed the destruction of irreplaceable treasures by people who simply did not understand their true value. The transition from preservation to control had been gradual and seemingly logical at each step. If people were destroying valuable things through ignorance, was it not reasonable to prevent them from having access to those things? If political leaders were making harmful decisions based on false information, was it not a moral obligation to provide them with correct information, or, if necessary, to prevent them from making such decisions at all? The memory spheres revealed that every generation of network members had struggled with these questions, and that many had recognized the dangerous path they were following. But they had also seen the consequences of inaction, the irreplaceable losses that occurred when they failed to intervene, and had convinced themselves that temporary authoritarian control was preferable to permanent cultural destruction. What made their story truly tragic was that they had been largely correct in their assessments. The peoples of Middle-earth had indeed been careless with their cultural heritage, allowing irreplaceable treasures to be lost through neglect, ignorance, or deliberate destruction. The network's preservation efforts had genuinely saved materials that would otherwise have been lost forever, and their superior knowledge did give them insights that could benefit everyone. But the spheres also revealed the ultimate futility of their approach. Knowledge imposed from above, no matter how accurate or well-intentioned, could never have the same value as knowledge freely chosen and personally understood. Cultural preservation that relied on controlling access to materials rather than educating people about their value was ultimately self-defeating, creating resentment and resistance rather than genuine appreciation. Standing in the heart of the ultimate archive, surrounded by the complete cultural memory of Middle-earth, both men finally understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. The network's great experiment in enlightened guardianship was doomed to fail, not because its goals were wrong, but because its methods were fundamentally incompatible with the freedom and dignity that gave those goals their meaning. The question that remained was what should be done with the vast treasury of knowledge and preserved materials they had discovered, and how Middle-earth's legitimate governments should respond to the revelation of the network's existence and activities. The enormity of their discovery settled upon both men like a shroud as they stood in contemplative silence among the memory spheres. The ultimate archive around them pulsed with the accumulated wisdom and folly of ages. But with that knowledge came a burden that threatened to crush the spirit of anyone who truly understood its implications. They had set out to catalog the remnants of an abandoned fortress, and instead had uncovered the greatest secret in Middle-earth's history, a revelation that would force every kingdom to reconsider its understanding of the past and its plans for the future. Elda Car found himself grappling with questions that had no easy answers. The network's preservation efforts had genuinely saved irreplaceable treasures that would have been lost forever without their intervention. Their methods might have been questionable, but their achievements were undeniable. How could he condemn an organization that had preserved the complete cultural heritage of his world, even if they had done so through deception and manipulation? Yet he could not ignore the authoritarian implications of what the network had become. Their vision of enlightened guardianship, however well-intentioned, represented a fundamental threat to the autonomy and dignity of the peoples they claimed to serve. They had appointed themselves as arbiters of cultural value without any mandate from those whose heritage they were protecting, and they had gradually evolved into something that resembled the very tyranny they had originally sought to resist. As they began to make their way back through the complex toward the surface, both men were acutely aware that their lives had been irrevocably changed by what they had learned. They could not simply file a report and forget what they had seen. The knowledge they now possessed carried with it responsibilities that extended far beyond their original mission to King Elisar and the government of Gondor. The journey back through the chambers and corridors they had explored felt like traveling through layers of time itself. Each room they revisited showed them different aspects of the same fundamental tragedy, the corruption of noble intentions into something that threatened the very values it was meant to protect. The beautiful gardens that had celebrated Middle-earth's natural diversity, the careful preservation workshops that had saved countless artifacts from destruction, the scholarly libraries that had maintained knowledge across the centuries. All had been created by the same impulse that had led to the authoritarian conspiracy. They had discovered in the deepest chambers as they climbed the stairs that would take them back to the upper levels of Minas Morgul. Boromir broke the long silence that had fallen between them. His voice was hoarse with exhaustion and emotion as he voiced the question that had been haunting both their minds. What do we do with this knowledge? How do we explain to King Elisir that the greatest threat to his kingdom's stability comes not from surviving servants of the enemy, but from people who genuinely believe they are protecting Middle-earth's cultural heritage? Eldacar had been wrestling with the same question throughout their journey back toward the surface. The network's operations extended throughout all the free kingdoms, with cells embedded within trusted institutions and sympathizers placed in positions of authority. Any attempt to expose or suppress them would likely trigger exactly the kind of chaos and destruction they claimed to be preventing, as their members would undoubtedly attempt to protect their hidden archives by any means necessary. Yet doing nothing was equally impossible. The network's plans for their great revelation would fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout Middle-earth, potentially triggering conflicts that could make the recent war against Sauron seem minor by comparison. The legitimate governments of the various kingdoms had a right to know that their authority was being systematically undermined by an organization that operated according to its own vision of how society should be organized. As they emerged into the pale morning light of Athelion, both men felt the weight of the ordinary world pressing back upon them after their journey through the extraordinary revelations hidden beneath Minas Morgul. The sun was climbing toward noon, though it felt as if they had been underground for days rather than hours. Birds sang in the trees that were slowly reclaiming the lands that had been blighted by shadow, and the air carried the scent of growing things and renewed life. But even as they breathed the fresh air and felt the warmth of sunlight on their faces, both men knew that the world around them was not as simple or innocent as it appeared. The network's influence extended into every corner of Middle-earth's cultural and intellectual life, and there was no way to predict how deeply their vision of enlightened guardianship had already taken root in the minds of scholars and leaders. Throughout the free kingdoms, the choice they faced was not simply between exposing the network and sealing their discovery, but between different visions of how knowledge and cultural preservation should be managed in the age that was dawning. The network's authoritarian approach offered efficiency and expertise, but at the cost of freedom and self-determination. The alternative of leaving cultural preservation to local communities and traditional institutions offered autonomy and authenticity, but at the risk of continued loss and neglect of irreplaceable heritage. As they began the journey back toward Minas Tirith, both men realized that their report to King Elisir would need to be far more than a simple catalog of what they had found. They would need to help the king and his advisors grapple with fundamental questions about the relationship between knowledge and power, between expertise and authority, between preservation and control. The discovery of the network's activities would force Middle-earth's leaders to confront uncomfortable truths about their own limitations and failures. The cultural losses that had motivated the network's formation were real, and the expertise they had developed was genuinely valuable. Any response to their activities would need to address these underlying issues rather than simply suppressing the symptoms. But perhaps most challenging of all would be finding a way to preserve the knowledge and materials the network had accumulated while ensuring that they would be used to serve the interests of all Middle-earth's peoples rather than the vision of a self-appointed elite. The memory spheres and vast archives hidden beneath Minas Morgul represented a treasure trove of inestimable value. But they also represented the most dangerous concentration of power in the history of the world. The gentle twilight of Athelion settled around them as they made camp on their final night before returning to Minas Tirith. But neither man found peace in the soft evening light that painted the recovering lands in shades of gold and amber. The weight of what they carried with them, the knowledge that would reshape Middle-earth's understanding of itself, made even the most beautiful sunset feel heavy with foreboding and possibility. Eldacar sat by their small fire, watching the flames dance and flicker as he tried to find words for truths that seemed almost too vast to comprehend. In the space of a single day, everything he thought he knew about good and evil, preservation and destruction, wisdom and folly, had been turned upside down and inside out. The Nine, whom he had been taught to fear as the ultimate servants of darkness, had revealed themselves to be tragic figures, whose greatest crime was loving beauty too much to let it die. The preservation network they had created represented something unprecedented in the history of Middle-earth, an organization that had transcended the simple categories of loyalty and betrayal to become something entirely new. They were neither heroes nor villains in any traditional sense, but something far more complex and troubling. Guardians whose dedication had transformed them into the very thing they had sought to protect against. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above them, the same stars that had looked down upon Middle-earth through all the ages preserved in the memory spheres, Eldacar found himself thinking about the cycles of time and the endless repetition of human folly and nobility. The network's chronicles had shown him that the current age was neither better nor worse than those that had come before, that every generation faced the same fundamental choices between freedom and security, between wisdom and ignorance, between preservation and change. What made their discovery so profound was not just the revelation of the network's existence, but the mirror it held up to Middle-earth's legitimate institutions. The failures and shortcomings that had motivated the network's formation were real, and they would not disappear simply because the conspiracy had been exposed. The loss of cultural heritage through neglect and ignorance would continue unless something was done to address the underlying causes that had made such loss inevitable. Boromir, keeping watch as the night deepened around their camp, found his thoughts turning to more practical concerns about the future. The network's sympathizers and agents were embedded throughout Middle-earth's institutions of learning and governance, and there was no way to predict how they would react when their great secret was finally revealed. Some might be grateful to be freed from the burden of deception and willing to work with legitimate authorities to find better solutions. Others might view any exposure as an act of vandalism that threatened everything they had worked to preserve. The memory spheres had shown them that the network's members genuinely believed they were serving the greater good, that their vision of enlightened guardianship was not a cynical grab for power, but a sincere attempt to protect what was most precious from those too ignorant to appreciate its value. Such conviction could not be easily overcome by rational argument or political pressure, and any attempt to suppress the network by force would likely trigger exactly the kind of destructive conflict they had spent centuries trying to prevent. As the fire burned low and the night grew deeper around them, both men found themselves drawn into contemplation of the larger questions their discovery had raised. The network's tragic evolution from noble preservation effort to authoritarian conspiracy illustrated a fundamental problem that every civilization had to face: how to preserve knowledge and culture across generations without stifling the freedom and creativity that made such preservation worthwhile. The Nine had begun with the best of intentions, seeking only to save beauty and meaning from a world that seemed determined to destroy them. But their privileged access to complete and accurate information had gradually convinced them that they knew better than others how such treasures should be preserved and used. The transformation had been so gradual and seemingly logical that each generation of network members had accepted it as necessary and inevitable, never recognizing that they were becoming the very thing they had originally opposed. Yet their achievements could not be dismissed or ignored. The vast archives hidden beneath Minas Morgul contained knowledge that could revolutionize understanding of Middle-earth's history, artifacts that could inspire new generations of artists and scholars, and preservation techniques that could ensure such treasures would survive for ages to come. The challenge was finding a way to make this knowledge available to all Middle-earth's peoples without allowing it to be controlled by those who claimed superior wisdom or authority. As dawn approached and the eastern sky began to lighten with the promise of their final day of travel, Eldacar finally spoke the words that had been forming in his mind throughout the long night of reflection. "We cannot simply expose them as conspirators and traitors," he said quietly. "Whatever they have become, they began as people who cared deeply about preserving what was most precious in our world. Their methods may be wrong, but their goals were noble, and their achievements are undeniable. If we approach this as a simple matter of law enforcement, we will destroy something irreplaceable and lose the chance to learn from their mistakes." Boromir nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in his companion's words, even as he recognized the practical difficulties they would create. "Then what do we recommend to the king? How do we protect Middle-earth from their authoritarian vision, while preserving the knowledge and treasures they have accumulated?" The question hung in the morning air like morning mist, beautiful and insubstantial, waiting for the warmth of wisdom to give it shape and substance. As they broke camp and began their final journey toward the White City, both men knew they were carrying more than just a report about abandoned vaults and hidden treasures. They were bringing back a challenge that would test the wisdom and character of everyone who heard their story, a puzzle that could only be solved by finding new ways to balance the competing demands of preservation and freedom, expertise and democracy, knowledge and wisdom. The story of what they had found beneath Minas Morgul would become legend in its own right, whispered in the halls of learning and power throughout Middle-earth, but its true meaning would only be revealed in the choices that others made in response to their discovery. And so their journey into the shadows of the past became a doorway into an uncertain but hopeful future, where the eternal questions of civilization would be asked once again with fresh urgency, and perhaps at last with wiser answers.